You are now listening to the Palm Pod, brought to you by RSPO, a global partnership to make palm oil sustainable.
Hi, I'm Fara Rom, and you're tuning into the Palm Pod, where we host engaging discussions, expert insights, and industry updates on sustainable palm oil, guiding consumers and businesses to make better choices for the planet. So we're in the year 2026. The beginning of February, we actually have a really special day, which is called World Wetlands Day, and it kind of ties up to the conversation that we're going to have today. And specifically, we're going to talk about peatlands. So peatlands are kind of the nature's OG carbon sinks, if I can say. They're quietly doing a lot of heavy lifting for our climate and ecosystems. And if you look at tropical regions, peatlands are low-lying forests with naturally high water levels because the soil stays wet and low in oxygen. So plants break down very, very slowly and allowing thick layers of organic material to build up over time. And I know this is a bit technical. We're going to have someone really special talking with us today, but to kickstart, I want you to think of peatlands as soil, like a giant wet sponge, where they're packed with old plant material that holds a lot of water and stores a huge amount of carbon underground. And when it's left intact, they help prevent flooding and keep carbon locked in the grounds. In this episode, we're doing a quick Peatlands 101, why they matter, why protecting them matters, and what happens when we actually get it wrong. So I'm joined today by Beatrice Baquero-Salah from PM.Haze, who's deep in the work on peatland protection and haze in the region, in Southeast Asia region. And she's also one of the youth speakers at the very first Youth at RT 2025 main stage talk that happened last year in Malaysia. So Beatrice, so good to have you here.
Thank you, Farah. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so before we begin, we want to know more about you. So please share us about who Beatrice Baquero-Salah is and your role at PM.Haze.
Sure. So, hi everyone to the listeners. My name is Beatrice, and I'm originally from Bogota, Colombia, actually, but I've been based in Singapore for around a decade now. I work at PM.Haze, like you mentioned. It's a nonprofit based here in Singapore, but we have a regional focus as well. And I've been working as the partnerships and outreach manager. Since I started this job over 2 years ago now, I've been learning a lot about peatlands, of course, about tropical forests, nature restoration, air pollution, of course, haze. But I also want to mention that I'm not an expert in ecology, and I'm also not, like a health professional. But I'm just very happy to share my thoughts as a young environmentalist and as a human rights advocate today.
That's great. So for listeners who may be new to this, can you help explain the basic of things? What are wetlands and where do peatlands fit into that picture?
Sure, yes. So like you already mentioned, they're giant sponges, basically. Wetlands are ecosystems, and, by the name wetlands, they are saturated with water, sometimes permanently or seasonally. They act like these big natural sponges, and like you said, they're OG carbon sinks as well. So they store the water. They also help improve water quality sometimes. Some examples, people probably know mangroves, and there's a lot of talks about mangroves right now, and they're considered as well wetland ecosystems, coastal wetland ecosystems. There's also swamps and, of course, peatlands. And many communities around the world rely on these ecosystems for their food, their livelihood, coastal protection, and that's why a lot of people are talking about mangroves nowadays. So yeah, wetlands are amazing. They play a huge role in climate regulation, like you mentioned, and the flood control. And so peatlands are just a subset of wetlands. They're a type of wetland. And yes, they're basically huge sponges or domes built up of organic material that has been accumulating over thousands and thousands of years. And so because that peat stays below water, waterlogged, it's just locking away massive amounts of carbon that has been accumulating over, thousands of years. So they're one of the most carbon-rich ecosystems. And in Southeast Asia, actually, we have 50 to 60% of the world's tropical peatlands. So we're really blessed to have these OG climate allies with us.
So why are peatlands considered one of the most important but yet overlooked ecosystems in this region, like Southeast Asia and even
Yeah.
globally?
There's different types of peatlands here in Southeast Asia. We have mostly the tropical peatlands. And like I mentioned before, I joined PM.Haze. I didn't even know what peatlands are. People in Singapore don't tend to know what they are either, even though we're surrounded by them. And they don't cover a lot of the land globally. They cover around 3% of the land. And yet, these peatlands that only cover 3%, they store more carbon than all of the forests combined in the world. So that's just to show the scale of their role in climate regulation. And in Southeast Asia, like I mentioned, we have around 50 to 60%. They're the largest, also most carbon dense. When I went to visit the peatlands, actually, in my first year, we can tell, you're walking on peatlands and they're kind of spongy. They're supposed to be moist. And we would learn about how to measure the peat depth as well. And on average, it can go down to 3 meters, but sometimes, there's research done where the peat depth can exceed 15 to 20 meters. So it's insane the amount of, organic material that's locked in underground. And so, yeah, they act as these natural climate regulators. Of course, they support a lot of biodiversity, including the endangered species. People talk about orangutans a lot, but even smaller ones. I learned that they hold the little colorful betta fish as well. The wild betta fish live sometimes in these swamps. And so, yeah, but sadly, despite their important role, these have been like the last frontier where, humans through different activities have been draining these peatlands. They've been converting them and just ignoring them in our land use planning. And the issue is once these peatlands are degraded, well, they do the opposite. Like you mentioned, they start to become sources of emissions, and of course, fires are more recurrent instead of being those carbon sinks.
I think you've already kind of transitioned to the next question, actually, because I think PM.Haze has long highlighted the link between peatland degradation and haze. So can you walk us through how damaged peatlands become a major source of fires?
Yeah. So again, the link is not obvious sometimes, especially if we're not working with peatlands. But healthy peatlands are supposed to be wet. They're supposed to be covered in water. They're naturally resistant to fire for that same reason. But once we start draining them, humans build canals to start taking the water out to be able to plant, for example, for agricultural purposes mostly. The water table starts to lower itself, and it starts to dry out the peat basically. And sun, of course, starts hitting the peat, and that's when it emissions, instead of absorbing emissions, it's releasing emissions, and the peat becomes, of course, super flammable because it's just dry organic waste, and any little spark can just spark a fire. So sometimes these fires can burn super deep below the surface, and it makes it really hard to identify and extinguish, and they can smolder for weeks or even months sometimes, and they're called smoldering fires. And so these fires are the really tricky ones to put out, and they release a lot of smoke for that same reason, because it's really dense, moist organic material. And so the haze we had in the past mostly came from the burning of peatlands, and that dense haze that came with the particulate matter that affects our health came from the burning of all of that carbon that was basically being released, right? So the result, of course, it's health crises, the regional air pollution that we face, and of course the large amounts of greenhouse gas emissions that are released. So they're a carbon vault basically, and once they're degraded and they lose that potential to hold all that carbon underwater, then you open up a Pandora's box basically.
So you also mentioned about like how sometimes the relationship between peatland degradation and haze is vague sometimes. So maybe can you just explain what are the biggest misconceptions that you've heard over and over again about the causes of transboundary haze? And if these are misconceptions, what are the real threats facing peatlands? Maybe something that is like related to peatlands. So.
Yeah, and it's funny we're talking about haze again in Singapore. Actually, it's been a while, and for the past couple of weeks, haze has been felt in Singapore again. There's a few hotspots around the region. I think it was coming from Malaysia, and others in the northern Mekong region. There's a few misconceptions. First, about the cause. So yeah, 2 in 1, I would say. So the haze, some people think that it's mainly caused by small farmers, for example, or that it's just accidental fires, but these are very man-made issues, but it's not necessarily the smallholders that are responsible. These are the scale of haze that we saw in the region was actually due to the large-scale peatland drainage and industrial land clearing practices, not just the smallholder burning that happens, and it's very localized still. Of course, we could talk about weak enforcement, but yeah, companies are not supposed to be using some of these damaging practices anymore, like the slash and burn that was very common and which led to a lot of the 2015 big haze episode. And so again, the large scale drainage of these peatlands, which is really hard to reverse, of course, and just not being able to keep them wet anymore, which makes a fire sometimes inevitable. So yeah, of course, major palm oil companies, because it's often been tied to palm oil, they have eliminated a lot of these practices. Of course, there was intense scrutiny, there were stricter regulations that came in, and of course certifications like RSPO that have set very clear policies on how to cultivate palm oil, for example, and other forms of agricultural practices that are more regenerative. Yeah, put ecological balance at the forefront. So yeah, I know, for example, RSPO has the no deforestation, no peat, no exploitation policy in place, and those are very important, because again, it's not just smallholder farmers, but it was actually very large scale fires that were just due to mismanagement of the land. The other misconception I would say is people think that it's a seasonal thing, not so much in Singapore, but in other places. We talk about it as it's a dry season problem or it's a weather problem. And yes, of course, because we have a dry season, fires are more likely to occur, of course. They're usually active during the June, October dry monsoon months. But even now, it's February and we're seeing it also with the northeast monsoon. So I would say it's not a weather problem itself, but it will also be even amplified by climate change, right? Which will increase the risk of drought, of course, and fire intensity. So it's, definitely not seasonal. This is a man-made issue. I think if we start to call it something seasonal, we sort of start to normalize it. And definitely this shouldn't be something that we normalize. This is a ecological crisis. It's definitely preventable. So yeah. And with that, maybe a third misconception, and it's that sometimes we like to say that humans are like a plague, that we're destructive, that, it's just better for us to disappear or to leave the forests alone. But with that, I also want to say that that's definitely not true. And that's a misconception. We can play a very positive role. We could talk to indigenous peoples around the world and they would tell you otherwise. They've been protectors of the land for centuries. So we can have a net positive effect too. We can help the land regenerate faster, which has been the role that PM.Haze has been trying to play. So not just leaving the forests alone, and there's a big discussion around conservation practices there. But yes, we as humans can also play a role in helping ecosystems regenerate and recover much faster. And that's where I think tech innovation, for example, or carbon finance projects, which is another huge topic right now, that's where, money should be going to support these restoration efforts.
So I think you actually touched this already, because then we want to look at, if degradation has happened, then what's next? Like what is the next step or the actions that we can take to maybe reverse it or improve it to a better state, right? So from PM.Haze perspective, like, you can elaborate a bit more, since you already mentioned a little bit of that. So what does effective peatland protection and restoration actually look like? And maybe if you can elaborate a little bit about what companies can do outside, or what smallholders can do. So
yeah, and that's where I say I'm not an ecological expert once again, or a hydrological expert, and getting peatlands to a pristine state again is impossible once they've been degraded. But definitely what we can try to do is try to mitigate further degradation and make sure that the communities can still live off of these peatlands by switching to maybe less destructive land clearing practices, for example, because a lot of the times it's an economic issue as well. Communities rely on this land, and sometimes palm oil was the only alternative. So at PM.Haze, we've been trying to support the development of other forms of livelihood, sustainable livelihoods. We're working on different agroforestry projects with the communities, switching from palm oil to other crops potentially that could grow better, because peatlands were never meant to be, ground to plant anything. I mean, the ground is very acidic. It's very hard to grow things on peatlands in the first place, but communities still rely on it. So we have to support those people first. Part of the protection is also making sure that there are no more fires, of course. So we need to monitor that fire risk. We need to monitor how the land is being used. So with PM.Haze, we started working on a drone project actually, and brought drones down so that the community could start doing that fire monitoring and mitigation more efficiently. And we saw that this also really motivated them to receive this sort of support and resources. And this was based on grant partnerships as well that we established. So monitoring the fire risk, supporting those alternative livelihoods. And of course, the restoration is a very lengthy process, from taking care of the nurseries where we grow the saplings to the planting, and everything has to be timed perfectly. So yeah, it's a really long process, and sometimes people don't see, the amount of work that truly goes into restoration. Yeah, it's not a 1 to 2 year thing. It's actually 10 to even further down. And speaking of carbon projects, sometimes they require 40-year commitments from communities, to make sure that the land that they're restoring will remain functional and will actually be preserved. So this requires, a lot of collaboration, which is what we've been trying to work on at PM.Haze as well, especially if haze is a regional issue that affects, all of us. Yeah, so that's just a few thoughts on our work.
So I think a lot of core work that PM.Haze is doing, basically the core value is actually to work with the communities that, that is protecting the peatland, and maybe like they depend their livelihood in the peatlands, and the focus on the initiatives that is, for example, conservation and such, should be centered around them. So that's what I get from what you shared. Just to segue, and just a quick fun fact. Beatrice and I met through PM.Haze Repeat program, which Beatrice led and focuses on building peatland knowledge among young people. So I think this is also another segment of communities or people that you are targeting. And can you tell us a bit about the program and how it's gone so far, and maybe what's next for the young people that you're engaging with?
Yeah, of course. This was a flagship program that we started running in 2024 called Repeat. So it's an expedition to experience peatlands, and it's for youth, specifically for youth from, I believe it's 18 to 35 years old, from Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore for now. We are hoping to expand geographically at some point, and it's precisely to bring these youths to visit peatlands, to see what the restoration process looks like, to draw the ties and to see the big picture of everything we've been talking about. Why is climate a thing? How is health related to this? Why is it so important to protect these peatlands in the first place? So it's been a 10-day expedition program, and plus some months of additional engagement that we require from the youth. So it's not just, a tourist go and observe and leave, but we do expect them to, think about projects that would support the communities or their own, in their own cities and countries as well. So it's basically, 10 days plus 4 to 5 months of additional engagement. And it's been amazing to see how they stay connected. It's a group of 20 very privileged youths that we select, and we've received many applications in the past 2 iterations. So it's also really nice to see that there's a lot of interest from the youth in the region to get involved in climate and environmental work. But often, there's not accessible opportunities for them. So Repeat is actually fully funded for youth. We wanted it to be a regional program as well, where there's this intercultural exchange happening, because, to solve a lot of these transboundary issues like haze or like climate change, there has to be cross-cultural collaboration and transnational dialogue happening. So that's why Repeat is a regional program. It's a 10-day program, because these issues, we can't explain everything in one day or one sitting, but it has to be really processed, and it has, they have to sit with everything they're seeing and reflect on everything we cover. So it's an intense program, adventurous program. Put out a lot of really nice videos recently on our latest expedition. So for the future, we're hoping to have these expeditions take place in the sites where we are actually working on peatland restoration in Indonesia, and we'll be launching a call for applications around March. So yeah, if anyone is interested, youth from the countries I mentioned, interested in just getting their hands dirty and taking action together, then that could be a great program for them.
That's excellent. And I think I want to mention one thing. What's really interesting about this program is the people that you recruited, the participants, are actually from different background. When I say different, it's like they're journalists, they're like researchers. So it's really interesting to see and how people are getting together despite their background, despite their expertise.
Yes.
And this is an excellent initiative from PM.
Yes. Thank you for. We also did that on purpose because we know that it's not just the biologists or the environmental studies people that have to be working on this, but it's really everyone that can have an impact and has a role to play. So yes, the journalists were there. We had artists. We had the environmental studies people, but we also had engineers. The first iteration, we had some finance people. So yeah, it really is all hands on deck. So we wanted to sort of mimic what that collaboration should look like in the real world as well.
I agree. And this is what climate change is about. Like, if you want to mitigate climate change, it doesn't just require biologists. It requires every single person. So I think it's like a good transition to the next question, because I think it's really related to what the initiative, the Repeat initiative is about. Why should people who live far from peatlands, like urban communities, consumers that don't really, directly benefit from, protecting peatlands and such, care about protecting peatlands?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's often what we're struggling with at PM.Haze in Singapore, especially. We feel very distant, very sheltered, and I mean, thankfully, we haven't had big haze coming. But it's only when it becomes visible or it starts to impact us directly that we try to, look for solutions and causes. But yeah, so we have that saying, right? Out of sight, out of mind, and that very much applies to us here in Singapore. But again, going back to the role that peatlands play in climate change, and climate change is going to affect everyone, through the heat waves becoming more recurrent, storms, rising sea levels. So it should already start to scare us for that simple reason. Peatlands need to be kept pristine. They need to be protected. If they're degraded, we should be doing everything we can to restore them, because yeah, it helps to mitigate the carbon emissions and support the global climate goals that we should all be working towards. So yeah, protecting peatlands, restoring them has actually been singled out as effective solutions, right, to draw down carbon. There's a really great organization called Project Drawdown, and they have a huge library of solutions to mitigate and address climate change, and protecting peatlands is one of them. So yeah, not only the climate aspect, but of course haze, which is not just ecological, but of course our health is affected. The healthcare system takes a big hit. And again, we've had haze in Singapore for the past 2 weeks, and I already saw an article actually saying that the doctors were seeing a surge in respiratory cases here as haze is persisting. So yeah, people start to get worried, and once the haze does come back, then we should be prepared. So it's better to be prepared and be informed now rather than later. And of course, as consumers, and again in Singapore, huge consumer country and huge consumer of palm oil and paper and other goods that are often linked to the peatland conversion we were talking about. So us as consumers, we definitely have a role as well. We can drive corporate change. We can switch to sustainable palm oil. We can look for those products that are peat free, that come from peat free supply chains. So yeah, definitely our choices also matter. And yeah, again, it's a really difficult question to answer. Why should people care? Sometimes we shouldn't spend too much effort trying to convince the those that are in denial, but I do believe that at some point the issue will just be right in our faces, right? And climate change will become the an imperative for everyone and will become a cross-cutting issue across all of the industries. So that's when it will really become easier to convince people to join this cause. But yeah, for now, of course, overall, it's not just an environmental issue, it's a public health issue, like I mentioned, economic as well, right? Because
Right.
the economy sort of stops if there's haze and you can't move or children can't go to schools. And of course, it's a climate justice issue because it's the communities on the ground that are most affected and have often the least resources to adapt and bounce back. So that's why I care, and I hope that me sharing all of this will also get people curious about learning more about our work, about peatlands, about the importance of nature-based solutions, of course, and want to join our movement.
I think it's really important when you mentioned about the intersectionality of climate change and how important it is for us to get climate justice. Because again, if everyone started to care, it means that I feel like it's a bit too late. But they should. But we don't want it to be too late until we can't do anything to reverse things that's already been done. But we actually are already at the end of our episode. But we have one last question for you, Beatrice.
Okay.
So if there's one lesson from the haze and peatland crisis that policymakers, companies, and the public must learn to avoid repeating this cycle, what would it be?
Wow, that's a tough last question, but I think bringing it back to it's a regional issue that requires collaboration. It requires sometimes making sacrifices. Sometimes, I don't like to use that framing, but it's not necessarily a sacrifice if what we're working towards is a livable future on this earth. Collaboration, putting the communities first and not just profits first, of course. And on your last point, you mentioned that if it's too late, and definitely I think it's never too late. We shouldn't even ask that question. At some conferences, they like to ask those questions as, is it too late to take action? Like there's no choice. Like it can't be too late. There's too much at stake. So the only choice and the only option is to move forward and to save as much as we can and protect as many peatlands as we can now.
Okay, I feel like I wish we can speak a bit more about this because I think it is a really important conversation that we should have. And not everyone, especially the young people, know about how important peatlands are for our future until the things that happens, like for example, haze and such. So you can access a PM.Haze website and get to know more about the activities that they have and learn a bit more about peatlands. But to end this episode, I would like to thank Beatrice. Thank you so much for our episode, and I hope this is something that is beneficial, of course, for our audience. And I hope a lot more people are more aware of what peatlands is about and the benefits of protecting our peatlands. So thank you so much, Beatrice.
Thanks, Fara. Thank you. And yes, all the youth, work with our youth. Work with it. We're ready.
Okay, so don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the Palm Pod on your favorite podcasting platforms. Feel free to share your feedback for our next episode. And I was speaking to our guest, Beatrice Baquero-Salah, Manager Partnerships and Outreach at PM.Haze. And I am Fara Rom, and this is the Palm Pod.